Officer, you've investigated hundreds of crashes, is that correct?
That's right.
In your testimony is you've never seen a crash quite like this, correct?
That's correct.
And you've never rendered an opinion that somebody committed suicide before, is that correct?
That's correct. This was the first time.
Officer, how can you make a determination that somebody committed suicide when you've never investigated one before?
Well, I've been trained to identify the causes of different types of accidents. And based on the circumstances in this case, particularly that there were no signs of skid marks, tire marks, that the car plowed directly into a tree, I've judged that this was a suicide.
So your testimony is that Mr. Hyde was intoxicated. He was driving down the road about 80 miles per hour. Is that correct?
Yes.
And he crossed the distance of 120 feet or 40 yards at 80 miles an hour, correct?
That's correct.
That would give him about 1 second to react. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
While drunk? Yes or no, officer?
Well,
Yes or no, officer?
that's not entirely correct.
Was he drunk, officer?
According to the coroner's report, he was.
And he had 1 second to react.
Not necessarily.
Officer, he traveled 80 miles an hour, 120 feet. The math says that he has 1 second to react. As a matter of fact, I ran it. It actually gives him 0.7333 of a second to react before he impacted that tree, that oak tree.
If I might respond.
No, officer, that's okay. Let's move on to the next question. Would you expect a drunk to react at the same level of alertness as would a sober person?
No.
Officer, you said that there was absolutely nothing wrong with Mr. Hyde's car. Is that correct?
The mechanics report indicated that they found no mechanical failures.
But you're saying that the car was entirely demolished. How can you tell that there wasn't anything wrong with it if every part was broken? You said it was just basically in pieces.
Objection, Your Honor. He is not making that statement. He's relying on the report from the lab.
Your Honor, the officer is stating that there was nothing wrong with the car. I think that he's opened the door to the subject.
Overruled.
And again, officer, I ask you, if this car was so blown apart that parts were demolished, fluids would leak out, parts were crushed, how can you tell that the brakes didn't fail?
Objection, Your Honor. He is not claiming the brakes didn't fail. He's merely reflecting the report indicated. If the lab technician were here who did the investigation, he could answer that. But Officer Fryman can only relay what was in the report.
Your Honor, the officer has testified that there was nothing mechanically wrong with the vehicle. He is an agent of the state. This is his lab. This is his credibility.
With all due respect, he did not testify there was no mechanical failure. He said he received a report that there was no mechanical failure. He cannot testify to the fact that the brakes failed or did not fail. He can only testify to the fact that he received a report that they did not.
Well, if they had all the right people who are the people who were doing the examination with the car, this witness had to, he had two given to him, examination, and in this particular situation, I think we'll just have to say that this, I'm gonna sustain it.
Thank you, Your Honor. Officer, your testimony was you arrived at the scene after the crash occurred.
Yes.
You didn't find any witnesses that saw the crash occur.
No.
So you have no way of telling whether Mr. Hyde fell unconscious with his foot on the gas, swerved for a deer, or any of these other myriad possibilities. Isn't that correct?
I can tell by the absence of marks on the pavement that it's unlikely that he swerved to hit a deer, because they would have left some sign.
Officer, in your vast 7 years of experience in investigating hundreds of crashes, have you ever had somebody who just swerved instead of hitting the brakes? Yes or no, officer? Please don't equivocate.
Yes.
And I'll ask you again. With 1 second to react while intoxicated with some unknown variable, can you be positive that Mr. Hyde committed suicide?
I would disagree with your characterization of 1 second, because there was about 1 second from the time that his car left the pavement until it struck the tree. However, he would have had more time than that to respond from the time he was on the road.
Actually, officer, from the time he left the road at 80 miles an hour and crossed 120 feet, that took 1 second, and then he hit the tree.
That's correct, but I wouldn't find skid marks in the wooded area on the side of the road. The skid marks I would expect to see, if this weren't something intentionally caused, would be on the pavement of the road itself. And during that time, there would have been more than just 1 second that you're talking about for him to respond.
So is it your testimony that everybody brakes whenever they swerve out of the way of something? Or when a component on their car breaks? Is your testimony that everybody in every emergency situation hits the brakes and leaves skid marks?
No.
No further questions, Your Honor.